All right, I think we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight for the launch event for Dissent's Winter 2021 issue. I'm Nick Serpe, Senior Editor at Dissent, and I'm joined here by three contributors to the winter issue, who I will introduce in just a minute. If you are watching this event on Zoom, but aren't a subscriber, you can pick up a subscription tonight for 25% off the normal price. We're going to drop a link for that in the chat in just a minute. I just got my copy in the mail today. Beautiful cover illustration by Molly Crabapple, so highly suggest picking up a copy. We also want to thank the DSA Fund for hosting us on the Zoom call tonight. And speaking of, on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, next Monday, January 18th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the DSA Fund, DSA's AfroSocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus, and Dissent are hosting a viewing of $16,000, a short film about reparations directed by Simone Baptiste. Baptiste will be there for discussion after the screening with Brody Reed and Ellington Wells, all moderated by Bianca Cunningham. And we'll put a link to register for that event in the chat as well. All right, on to our program for tonight. Let me start by introducing our panelists. Vanessa Williamson is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. She is co-author with Theda Skocpol of The Tea Party and the Remaking of Republican Conservatism. Jasson Perez is an organizer for DSA's AfroSocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus, focuses on mass-based campaigns to defund police and mass incarceration and bring about socialism. And you can also find him rapping with the group BBU. Finally, Alyssa Battistoni, a new editorial board member here at Dissent, is a political theorist and postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, the Harvard University Center for the Environment. She is the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Vanessa, Jasson, and Alyssa are all going to talk a bit about their articles in the winter issue. After that, I'll ask a few broad questions for all of them to answer. They'll have a chance to discuss any issues that come up among them, and then we'll turn to some audience questions. If you are in the Zoom call right now, you can ask questions by submitting them using the Q&A function in Zoom. And just a little note before we get started with Vanessa, I want to say a few additional words because we planned this issue and this event around the need to think seriously about the many challenges and crises that we anticipate facing in the after the closing of the Trump era. But the storming of the Capitol last week by right-wing militants is going to cast a shadow on any discussion of US politics right now. And we know there could be more political violence in the week ahead. I think whatever our disagreements on what to call the storming of the Capitol or the politics of the American right at this conjuncture, I think most of us were very disquieted by what we saw on Wednesday. And it's made all the scarier because we know that the armed rioters, however small their numbers might be right now, are interrelated with much more powerful forces in American life, from the police and border agents to Republican officials in the federal government and at the state houses all across the country. Which brings me to a last point before we get started. Hardcore Trump supporters, out white supremacists, QAnon conspiracists, they aren't the only cruel or immiserating forces in American life. And we need to pay attention wherever harm and injustice are done and to intervene and organize wherever there's potential to build power, to take on institutions and individuals who militate for more barbarism or even just for status quo ante. This is some of the things that we try to think through in this issue and that I'm excited to talk about with the panelists tonight. But tonight and going forward, I anticipate we will be talking about the far right as well as a whole host of other things. All right, so thanks for indulging me with that. Now we're going to get started with Vanessa, who's going to talk about her excellent historical account in this issue of the post-Confederate politics of the taxpayer. Vanessa, can you tell us a little bit about the history you unearthed for this article and how it relates to present-day politics in the Republican Party?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So the piece that's in this month's magazine is about the politics at the end of Reconstruction, that is to say, at the end of America's first experiment with multiracial democracy after the Civil War, when federal troops were ensuring that Black people got to vote in the South. And yeah, I mean, as we all know, for the lost cause, the Confederates didn't really accept defeat in any meaningful sense. And the piece I look at is about a particular organization that was called the South Carolina Taxpayers Convention, which was led by even in South Carolina, what were genuinely quite extreme Confederates. One of them was the first senator in the United States to withdraw from the Senate after Lincoln's election. Another was a general who refused to surrender at Appomattox, literally refused. And so these folks, who anyone should have been able to identify as secessionist stalwarts, kind of rebranded themselves after it was clear that the North was committed to ensuring that Black men could vote in the South. They rebranded themselves as no longer as representatives of the white race, which is how they had discussed their own politics earlier, but now as taxpayers. And they set up a taxpayers convention and released very sober and upset, analyses supposedly of the budget of the South Carolina government, which they noted had gone up substantially since the population of South Carolina had doubled and the war had destroyed the infrastructure of the entire state. But they didn't mention that second part. They simply noted that the budget had gone completely out of control. And, surely we need some fiscal responsibility in these times, right? That's the rhetoric that they were using. At the same time, those very same people were organizing paramilitary forces that would overthrow the elections in South Carolina and bring to end Reconstruction in the state. And so my piece looks at how they use the rhetoric of the taxpayer to do that. First of all, they use that rhetoric, as I already suggested, to indicate their respectability and their legitimacy in the North. They also use that taxpayer rhetoric to build alliances with poorer whites, right? So one of the great questions of Reconstruction is, for how long and how profoundly could poor whites have been brought along with Reconstruction governments if they had been given a chance? Right. And in the first elections in South Carolina, in fact, in other states in the South, you could see striking numbers of low-income whites, right, basically subsistence farmers in Appalachia-type regions, the upcountry as it was known, were voting Republican, right? They were voting with freedmen to set up a new kind of democracy, in fact, a democracy at all in the South. And the sort of Confederate leadership, the elite, the plantation elite, were a little bit shocked, frankly, to find that that they couldn't just appeal to racism and win, because that was how they tried it first. They were like, well, we are white people, you can't vote with these Black people, and they found that that wasn't an effective line, or it wasn't effective enough to win elections. And so they came up with this new rhetoric of the taxpayer, and it was effective in part because poor Southern whites were paying higher taxes if they owned land, because one of the ways that Reconstruction governments were trying to pay to rebuild the state, both to provide public education for the first time, both to Black and white children, to rebuild, the roads and everything else that had been destroyed in the war, they had to raise land taxes. And so plantation elite found taxpayer rhetoric a way to elide over the fact that some people were in fact very rich and some people were in fact very poor, but they were all landowners. And so this was a way to get around that really substantial class divide among whites. But the piece of the story that I think is most relevant to the contemporary moment is how well that rhetoric played in the North, right? We're talking 1871, 1874, when these conventions were held. And they received rave reviews in Northern papers. The Nation, for example, talked about how these were the men who must purify Southern politics if it can be purified, right? These are Confederate generals. The war is barely over. And yet the North has already abandoned, many Northern elites have already abandoned the Southern cause, right? And in particular, they've abandoned their commitment to Black freedom. Why is that? That taxpayer rhetoric really sold in the North among wealthy Republicans, because they were looking at influxes of immigrants, working class people who were bringing with them a new kind of rhetoric about working class rights, about class antagonism, that they were very frightened of, right? So you actually see in the North, in the period of redemption, which is what we call the period after Reconstruction, when white supremacy was re-solidified in the South. In that same period in the North, many states, and including big cities like New York, seriously considered rolling back universal suffrage, right? Universal male suffrage had been in place for decades, and they seriously considered putting the powers of the city, New York City, in the hands of a board of finance that would be elected by people who paid at least $500 in taxes a year. And we're talking about the 1870s, that was a lot of money. It would have disenfranchised a third to a half of New York City men, right? So I think when we're looking at the contemporary moment, when you're seeing people storm the barricades around the Capitol shouting, "We pay your bills," right? That's what we saw last week. You have to recognize that this isn't some new phenomenon. The sort of Reagan-esque, Goldwater-esque rhetoric about the taxpayer, that's nothing new. That's the very origins of anti-tax rhetoric in this country come from a defense of racism. And so I think that that's one important piece to recognize. The other thing that I think last week made more relevant is the recognition that if you legitimize anti-democratic actors, you empower them. You do not bring them to the middle. You do not moderate their politics. You do not, help hold with unity the country together. You are taking an enormous risk. And so, I mean, that feels incredibly obvious to say, but it feels also relevant right now.
Thank you, Vanessa. We're going to turn to Jasson now. Jasson, we've lived through decades of backlash politics against the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle that seems to come up particularly during election seasons. And after the 2020 election, we heard from some Democrats, the day after, that the uprising last spring and summer after the police killing of George Floyd and the slogan of defund the police in particular were responsible for the underperformance of a number of Democratic candidates or the Democratic Party as a whole. Can you tell us a bit about how and why you wanted to push back on this argument?
Yeah, thank you for having me, first of all. I think, my basic contention was that, the Floyd protests and what's associated with it, the defund protests, I would argue save the Democratic Party and Biden from themselves, and I say that by actually igniting Democratic voter registration, closing the enthusiasm gap created by Democrats, in terms of their persuasion campaigns that they're trying to do, and also getting rid of any sort of progressive or radical demands, like Medicare for all, Green New Deal. And then also too, I think, the activity that we saw brought in more election volunteers and organizers to assist with turnout. And I think at some level, this is totally anecdotal, right? Is that that I think, being able to organize people to care about your local city budget has some sort of impact and effect in terms of people actually being involved in politics, caring about politics, understanding how politics works and doesn't work. And it's, for me as someone who's been in many budget fights where nobody cares, nobody's interested in it. Defund was a welcome surprise to people just pouring through a budget, asking questions that are, just going through the whole rigmarole and seeing, of course, how Vanessa just spoke to how undemocratic even local city budget processes are. So just to set the scene though, before the uprisings, the scene was actually pretty grim for Democrats, right? There was a decision by Biden and the Dems not to do any canvassing due to COVID. And even though people were telling them there's safe ways to do it, registration numbers were down for Dems compared to the GOP. There was an enthusiasm gap drop off that happened post Super Tuesday in terms of where Democratic enthusiasm dropped off about 12 percentage points compared to Republican enthusiasm gap. Depending on how you feel about enthusiasm gap, that I think that means at least something. And then again, there was a refusal for Democrats to actually campaign on Medicare for all or any of the things that actually energizes its base to come out, knock doors, do donations, all the things that you need in order to actually run a campaign versus just persuade voters to come onto your side. And also too, Dems totally messed up on any sort of either campaigning on or fighting for a robust COVID economic relief or public health relief, right? So no $2,000 a month, no, universal contact testing and tracing, no expanding capacity of hospitals locally, and nothing like that. And they weren't running on that message either. They were mainly running on a message of staying home, stay safe, kind of a very individualizing position in terms of how to actually contain COVID. And then in response to all that, there was an anti-lockdown, anti-mask protest that started springing up all over. And I think sometimes people forget, before that was kind of the main zeitgeist that was defining the moment. It was the right wing's message on how to handle COVID. COVID's not that bad. This is going against our rights. And so that was really conditioning what was going on. And also Joe Biden just had disappeared. He was just nowhere. He wasn't talking, he wasn't doing anything, he wasn't campaigning. It was, so there was that moment. And so then the defund uprisings come along, right? 15 to 26 million people estimates are voter registration numbers, go up substantially, especially in places like Georgia, Michigan, and Minnesota. Enthusiasm gap closes, right? And like as you got closer to the election, Democratic voters are actually 8 percentage points more enthusiastic than GOP voters. And I would say that the act of protesting polarized the general public against Trump and against the right wing, especially in terms of Trump's law and order approach, right? And this had the effect of, again, depressing Trump's numbers. There wasn't much it could get depressed on more, but it still depressed those numbers. But more importantly, because his numbers were depressed in regards to Corona also. But I believe in disruptive power, like in terms of how Piven describes it, and disruptive power is able to activate a latent base that usually isn't necessarily activated around an issue, even though their self-interest and political interests might actually align with the issues of the day that are going on, right? And so, and I believe that the protests actually had that effect for people who were more radical, like myself, who believe in defund, socialism, Green New Deal, and then also people like my family members who are more liberal, don't quite get on the thing, but it activated them and also moved them around in terms of voting, caring about voting, and turning folks out. So, and I would submit too that if there was an actual protest, around COVID that had a bold demand or a big demand around like, universal basic income for the duration of COVID, it would have had the same effect also, but it didn't. It was the defund uprisings that allowed for that. So, and then I think the last point is that there's a tendency on the left and even mainstream pundits to kind of put, electoral organizing over here and then direct action, even like militant insurrectionary direct action over here, and put them in opposition to each other. And at times you can even see Dems and even sometimes progressives and folks on the left. There was like credible socialist folks who are saying that this is going to have a demobilizing effect and embolden the hand of the right wing. And I would submit that, that election, I mean, the best of the left is when, when the disruptive hand is working with the electoral hand in unison and in some sort of like, not linear strategy, but in some sort of way. And I think that that's what happened during the defund protests. And I think even with groups like Mi Gente, Lucha, WFP, Frontline Project that were part of mobilizing the Floyd protests, but then we're also critical in organizing in Georgia, Arizona, Minnesota. So I think that there's a meaningful linkage there. And so I think, and I want to make this point because then I'm gonna, kind of oddly pivot to the Capitol riot coup, whatever seized on the Capitol, which is that, an overall commitment to disruptive power plus a bold demand is foundational to like any sort of left project if we want to win, right? And disruptive protests doesn't necessarily have to be what we saw with the Floyd protests, but it has to be at least what we see with even the protests that Sunrise and acts of civil disobedience that Sunrise engage in around elected officials and corporate power. It has to polarize the public. It has to demand the question of which side are you on and what is the political agenda going to be. And so, when it comes to the seizing of the Capitol, right, I think it's something that, we're getting into all these debates on what it was or what it isn't, and we're not actually having a debate around strategies and tactics to actually beat back whatever you want to call it, a dead insurgent right or whatever insurgent right. I would submit though, similar to, post-Reconstruction, no one would say that was a strong Confederate right that was there. It was a fairly defeated one. It was a fairly weak one. And I think in about 12 years or something, as Vanessa's article shows, they rebranded themselves, found other avenues of power, and still use, insurgent forms of politics, which is, violence, outright violence, plus that rebranding in order to regain power. So I think it's something that you have to take serious. And I think what's been most disappointing right now is even post the election, and even now, and Jamie McLeavy had a similar analysis, is groups like Protect the Result, Choose Democracy, Frontline, all organizing tables that was supposed to mobilize us and coordinate us in this moment, right? In this moment of trying to undermine the election, haven't done so. No calls for mass protests, no calls for even targeted protests that make sure that we avoid right-wing confrontations. And most people are just going along saying, well, we should take the legal means, the legislative means, and even taking capitalists at their words, like business tables saying, oh, what Trump did was bad, you know. But when you kind of look under the covers, you know, of the 144 corporations that actually gave to Trump or those GOP elected officials who voted to overturn the election, only 4 thus far have said, we're not going to give to the GOP and those GOP members anymore, right? Like, these are just words that they're saying. We have to compel them through action, and not just, you know, I mean, impeachment and expulsion of those members, but then also too, of those corporations, like holding those corporations accountable who actually funded such an effort. And I would submit that a foundational part of that is a commitment to calling mass protests and targeted protests of those who are responsible for it. I think that is the only way that you can beat back the right, and certainly beat back an insurgent right. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that, Jasson. All right, Alyssa, after the election, you wrote a piece for Dissent about a sort of idea that had started circulating that Joe Biden was going to be the first real climate president in the United States. So, you know, you wrote about this idea, and I want to ask, you know, what would it mean to be a climate president? Do you think it's likely? And what are the shortcomings of even the best case version of that outcome?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I really am thrilled to be talking to Vanessa and Jasson because their pieces are great. And I think there's a lot of sort of shared ideas that we can get into. But so yeah, the question, the piece is sort of asking the question, will Joe Biden be the first climate president? And that phrase refers to basically the idea that in you know, in the immediate aftermath of the presidential election, when Congress was still kind of up in the air prior to the Senate runoffs, and Democrats had lost seats in the House, it was kind of unclear what was going to be possible legislatively. So in the face of that, a lot of groups were saying, well, look, it doesn't matter whether we win the Senate, we being Democrats, whether or not we all identify as the we of the Democratic Party. In any case, but it doesn't matter whether or not Democrats win the Senate, because Joe Biden can do all of this stuff through executive action. He can appoint all of these people to cabinet positions, even though at some point it was kind of unclear who would be able to be confirmed by a McConnell-controlled Senate, so some of that even was kind of uncertain. But you know, the basic idea again was that that there are a lot of things that a president, that executives alone can do on climate to decarbonize in various ways, and that was something that that Biden should like commit to doing right away. And I guess I would say, you know, the sort of second part of your question, I think is the most relevant for us, which is this the right question, I guess, or what are the limits of that framework? Because I think, you know, there are things that a president alone can do on climate, but I think that to fixate on those or to talk about Biden as a climate president and that as being sort of like the most we hope for or push for in this moment is a real mistake. It's something that I'm very worried about as kind of the sort of horizon of like climate politics under a Biden administration. And that's because really I think what that sort of suggests is a path on climate where you are trying to enact climate policy without people knowing you're enacting climate policy, to decarbonize what people are really paying attention to, do as much as you can around the margins through you know, various, to do climate policy without talking about climate, without talking about the Green New Deal, which Biden obviously tried to move away from. There was sort of a similar debate to the one that Jasson talked about around defund after the presidential election, and Democrats lost seats in the House, suggesting that like the Green New Deal and defund were both part of this kind of like left-wing specter that was making it hard for centrist Democrats to win. And so the idea is that you are either trying to make climate change less threatening to people in order to do things that might have bipartisan consensus and so on. I really hope that last week, if nothing else, will convince people that bipartisan consensus is just like not is not the way to go. It is a fantasy. And even like Mitt Romney, who has kind of emerged as like the reasonable Republican, who's like an anti-Trump Republican, was saying immediately after the election, we're gonna make sure we're not moving away from oil and gas and so on. So like even the supposedly the like good Republicans are very committed to fossil fuels. And I don't think we should kid ourselves otherwise. But anyway, all of this is to say that I would say that it's a real mistake to try to, we need to decarbonize as fast as we can. I get that there are time pressures, but I think that we are taking shortcuts that in the long run are making us take the long way around if we're trying to avoid confronting climate change head on, and doing so in a way where people, where you're not just saying, oh, look the other way, climate policy is happening because people don't like climate policy, and instead you want people to notice it and see that it's like good for them, that it's something they want because it's it means that they can catch the bus to work more easily, that they have a green job. I think especially right now, like when we're in this huge and lasting economic crisis, like this is really the time to have a big green job package. It's not just saying the private sector will create jobs if we like subsidize some R&D now, in like 10 years, some like solar company will create some private sector jobs, but that like literally the federal government will hire people to do a lot of public infrastructure type stuff that we need, that will start building green public housing amidst an ongoing, an immediate housing crisis around evictions, but also an ongoing crisis of affordable housing, that we're going to tackle a bunch of things that are serious issues in people's lives and do so in a way that's also decarbonizing. And that's the whole idea of the Green New Deal. And the fact that that Biden and a number of other centrist Democrats have tried to like run away from that, I find very concerning. Not necessarily because they have to talk about the Green New Deal per se, and like people will often point out that Biden says like, I'm not for the Green New Deal, but then he has all these Green New Deal policy proposals in his like climate policy plan. That's true, and I would rather have him like do the Green New Deal than talk about the Green New Deal. But I'm not, I am not convinced that he's committed to doing a lot of the kind of like big, the most like, really, the big spending, the most like aggressive and robust pieces of the Green New Deal that are like about using the power of the federal government to deliver on all of these things that we need. So I think we really need to think seriously about that. And I'm particularly concerned about the way that, as Jasson said, that COVID played out, where there was very little throughout the campaign discussion of like COVID as an economic, or critique from Democrats of the kind of like economic crisis of COVID. And it became like a safety v economy debate basically between Biden and Trump. And I think there's like a huge missed opportunity. I think something that we're gonna see, I'm very worried that we'll see that repeat on climate. And I think that Republicans will try very hard to push that on climate, where it's like either, like safety being like preventing climate disasters or whatever, or like strong economy kinds of stuff. And that seems likely to succeed amongst some number of people. The kind of cures worse than the disease kind of thing seems likely to come back with climate. And I think that we're in a period, when we were talking and thinking about the Green New Deal and writing our Green New Deal book, we always thought that like a crisis moment would be a moment when you could start implementing big projects, like on the scale of like a huge jobs program, like the kinds of like major and potentially transformative policies that seem like really hard to move in like normal times. And so we're in that moment, but we're not seeing that kind of like moving. We're not seeing those kinds of transformative ideas being put forward or fought for. And like, again, there are obviously the Democratic Senate victories change the calculus somewhat, but not if Democrats aren't like actually trying to use even like limited power in some way. And I think if you don't use the crisis, someone else is going to. I'm really worried about a repeat of the kind of like 2016 war on coal rhetoric, as we're seeing like a huge crash of the oil and gas industry in this country, which would be good insofar as like oil and gas bankruptcies would mean that like it's an opportunity to like, I would say, kick the fossil fuel industry while it's down. There was talk about like nationalization, and back when oil prices were like super low and all of these companies were really cheap. It's a really good time to do like a green jobs program to demonstrate proof of concept of green jobs, which I think for a lot of people is like a good idea, but like feels very abstract and like, you know, an idea that people talk about, but why would you trust that if you haven't seen it? So I think we're in a really good moment to really like show that these things can work. But if we don't, then it's just like, oh, there's a lot of people who have lost jobs. 100,000 people in the US are estimated to have lost, in the oil and gas industry are estimated to have lost jobs this year. There is, I think that is, without like taking that on directly and talking about what Democrats are going to do for those people, what people are going to do to like move away from that industry instead of just like it seems like either ignoring it on the one hand or pretending that those jobs can come back, like Connor Lamb in Western Pennsylvania talking about how like banning fracking is this crazy idea and we need to just like keep fracking. Fracking is not a viable job provider, even in the short term. Like it's a very volatile industry. Like a lot of these jobs aren't coming back. And I think that if Democrats aren't like tackling that directly, both rhetorically, but also with like the money and programs and all of these things, or we seem like vulnerable to a repeat of the war on coal kind of thing. And like the idea that even if Democrats aren't, you know, even if these job losses and so on aren't the result of climate policy, that it doesn't matter, right? Like that's not what happened with the war on coal. It's not that like Obama had actually like used climate policy to destroy the coal industry. It was like job losses in coal were due to a lot of other things, but that didn't stop Trump from using it. So anyway, in short, I really think it's these are like not easily solved problems, but I don't think that just kind of like trying to avoid them and to avoid like that again, like the heart of the Green New Deal in terms of like actually connecting climate policy to like concrete material improvements in people's lives, particularly in a moment of like economic crisis. I think we really have to do that. And so I think I'll just close by reiterating Jasson's call for like the need for a simultaneously disruptive kind of like external force of movement with the kind of electoral piece of it. And I think we really need both of those together. I am hopeful that will, you know, I think the climate movement has like really come a long way in the past several years in terms of like taking those kinds of disruptive actions, putting pressure on elected officials, sort of toggling between like direct action and like making calls for people who they think they need to win electoral seats. So that seems really good. But I really think that like we're going to be in this ongoing like economic health, you know, crisis for a long time to come, and we really need to like continue making very strongly the case for like, you know, we're in an eviction crisis, we need the green housing. We are in a jobs crisis, we need the green jobs. We have to like be tackling these two crises together, and to do that now publicly in ways that people notice instead of trying to again like sweep it under the rug.
Thanks, Alyssa. We're gonna turn in about 10 or 15 minutes to some audience questions. So you can start to submit those if you're in the event right now through the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to answer some of those. But before we do that, I wanna sort of toss out a bit of a historical scenario to everyone here. Let's go back 12 years in time. A Democrat is coming to the White House. There's majorities in both houses of Congress, and we're in the midst of a pretty severe economic crisis. I'm going to stop because like clearly the mood right now is couldn't be more different than the kind of exuberant and hopeful moment that we had in 2008. You know, we've got a more entrenched conservative majority on the Supreme Court, a much more sort of militant and frightening right-wing movement on the ground. We have a left that is actually visible to the public, which there really wasn't, I would argue, for the most part in 2008. And we're also facing a moment where there seems to be a broad feeling among many people of a kind of institutional paralysis, a kind of crisis of governance amid this, ongoing public health crisis that, is not being handled in a way that seems to lead to a quick resolution. So the reason I toss this all out is because I feel like it might be helpful to think back a little bit to that time and sort of some of the lessons that I think have become sort of common sense through the Obama era. And then, through the Trump administration to kind of think about where we are now, left, center, right in this country. Are there things that you think are from this recent past that are kind of going to be important to keep in mind going ahead? Are we in some uncharted territory? And maybe Vanessa, we can start with you again, since you did co-author with Theda Skocpol a book on the Tea Party, which I feel like has in some ways left the public memory in a big way in the face of, Trumpism. So maybe we can start there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to think more about that. So for folks who don't remember it as clearly as I do, the Tea Party was the conservative reaction to the Obama administration that in important ways allowed the Republican Party to regroup. I think it's important to remember how thoroughly defeated the Republican Party was or appeared to be at the end of 2008, right? Not only had Barack Obama been elected president, our first Black president, he came in with strong majorities, and President Bush left office with extraordinarily low levels of approval, far lower than Trump. And so I think, and the sort of Iraq war and the economic crisis and all of these things really tarnished the Republican Party in the eyes of the public. And within a few months, conservatives had reorganized themselves, arguing basically, unconvincingly even at the time that they were not Republicans, but conservatives were organizing in the streets, taking on a sort of rhetoric and a symbolism of Americana to rebuild the conservative opposition to Obama. And I do think that Democrats were not ready. I think that's pretty obvious. They were not ready for the strength of the reaction that they received. And I think, I think there are at least two lessons that could be drawn, plausibly are lessons that those in the Biden administration have thought through. The first simply is that you don't have long. I think everyone knows that now. You don't have long to make any kind of change, right? Just the extent of the inertia in our incredibly sclerotic system is extraordinary. And I think that is one thing that is something that was very clear in the Obama administration, that the speed with which the momentum was gone was just so fast. And the other thing I'd say is that, in very different ways, there was a time for accountability at the end of the Bush administration, right? About the financial crisis, most obviously, but many other matters as well. And those opportunities were not taken in terms of identifying who was at fault for the crisis that engulfed the country in 2008. And I think that is another question that's before us and another lesson that could be drawn. Whether we will learn it or not is not so clear. That said, I do think there are, it's very clear that the resurgent right of today is, its forebear, one of its forebears was the Tea Party. Obviously, there were many forebears earlier than that too. But I think the attack on the Capitol to some degree may have, in sort of the same way that I think Charlottesville may have genuinely changed perceptions of the right in America. I think that the presence of Confederate flags with Nazi flags in Charlottesville alerted a large number of Americans to the similarity of those ideologies, which obviously, that shouldn't have been even remotely difficult to see. They were both white supremacist movements. But I think it was difficult for people to see, and I think that changed that. I think the attack on the Capitol may well in my optimistic moments, think may well bring greater attention to the long-standing danger of white supremacist violence in this country. And so those I think are the lessons, and those are the sort of, you could call them opportunities that we might be able to learn from.
Thanks, Vanessa. Alyssa, Jason, either one of you can feel free to jump in now on this big question.
Yeah, and I can go. Yeah, I think you know, I think I just want to point out that, like, similar to like the last time when a Democrat won, you know, and them seem like they won at some level, all of a sudden, you know, like the think piece industrial complex just having a bunch of pieces about how weak the GOP is, and, you know, the future looks bleak for them, and obviously it's for different reasons now and different conditions or whatever. But I think, you know, I'm more on like the, you know, for better or for worse, on like the Ezra Klein Vox side of things, of just saying that, you know, it's important to remember that, you know, our system is for the most part anti-democratic when it comes to the electoral process, and it greatly favors the GOP to the point where they can get millions less votes and still get way more power. And the left and the Dems need millions more votes just to get to a draw, and then to have a coalition that's able to govern or do anything. You still need somewhat of like almost like a near supermajority, which means then that we would theoretically need tens of millions more votes in order to have that. And I feel like that so much like sets the conditions, like the tone and the ability of us to be able to govern. So within that context of, if we're usually only using electoral politics to get us to a draw, which we should view it as, and at times have like a marginal, you know, amount of governing power. I mean, of course, we should use it to hold those who have done wrong accountable, for sure, right? And will that or won't that happen? I don't know. You know, I mean, there's impeachment things. There's a bill from Cory Bush saying that we should do expulsions. In my mind, the only way it passes is if we also do, you know, protests and get in their faces about it to actually pass it, or else it just won't pass. It'll be dead on arrival. I mean, impeachment may go somewhere, but I don't think it's going to do what people think it's going to do at this time. And so within that context, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but, you know, we have to start thinking about where is the labor movement in terms of doing strikes, in terms of workplace organizing, and then where's the other parts of the left, like DSA, WFP, Movement for Black Lives, in terms of you know, committing to, you know, a disciplined program of direct action. And these are things that you can train folks in and that you can do, and it doesn't just have to be reliant upon spontaneity. But I think, you know, a lot of times people now are saying that, like, well, this time we know we're going to have to hold Biden's feet to the fire, unlike we did with Obama, which, you know, like, like when you say it, that sounds good, it sounds true, but what does that actually mean in terms of what, you know, like what big labor is going to do, what the big progressive organizations are going to do? And I think that's why I get so worried about the responses in terms of what happened post the election, in terms of what the GOP was doing. And for sure, the Democrats are going to Democrat. You know, we can always count on them to be like, trust the process, do this, do whatever. You know, I mean, they gave us Bush v. Gore, but just to see, like, you know, labor orgs and other big progressive organizations just kind of sit on their hands and say, well, let's see how this goes, let's figure it out. I think that's dangerous, and I'm still worried about that's what's going to happen in this moment. I think another thing is that we still need to be committed to a program that, while still trying to get wins in this moment, as in terms of a framework of relief, that we should be trying to get much more bigger inroads at the state level and at the local level with running socialist and hard progressive candidates, and trying to like expand our base and expand like our level of power in that way. And I think in that, so I just, for the most part, I don't look at this moment as that much can happen federally still. Maybe I'm being too cynical, but that it is a moment for more enterprising and more confrontational, like electoral politics and direct action politics for the left.
So it's, I guess with respect to climate, I think that 2009 is very instructive. And I think a lot of, you know, there are a lot of lessons to learn, both from the the stimulus package, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which is like the big Obama stimulus package, which had like, so, you know, I think it was like $90 million for like funding, mostly R&D to green energy, which like has had an effect in developing like lower cost wind and solar, and like did have like ripple effects on renewable energy in important ways. But again, it was this kind of like both like a pretty, I mean, the whole stimulus package was very small. It was like really not adequate to the level of the economic crisis, and it didn't do things like you know, keeping people in their homes. It didn't like, you know, it left open, again, I think this kind of, a lot of my anxiety about our current crisis moment actually comes directly from what I see as a huge missed opportunity on the part of the Obama administration to really like both to use this moment when like the financial industry is completely really at the mercy of the federal government, when the, you know, Democrats have power in Congress and in the executive branch, like when they can really, they really could have done, I think, a huge amount more than they did. And I'm really, you know, we're not even in that position now. Like I mean, there are a lot of things that are different about the current moment. But I think that was a really big missed opportunity, both to like create an ongoing, you know, to like, to deliver on a lot of things people needed in a moment of crisis, to like consolidate a like constituency of people who are like, oh, I see this thing like happen for me and I want more of that to happen in the future. Like the state like gave me something and I want more of that in the future. To like spend more on climate in ways that again had that direct impact, instead of being like, here's some money for a bunch of like, you know, like tech companies that are working on solar stuff that again, like one day might trickle down into some like jobs for people who like are currently out of work, but that's like a, you know, kind of distant cause and effect, all these things. Anyway, so I think that was a missed opportunity for a bunch of reasons. And then I think that the second one came in the kind of big climate policy failure of the Obama administration, the Waxman-Markey bill, which was like the big bipartisan package that was like, had a bunch of like corporate support. This is like a cap and trade bill that was like very like, you know, like kind of like wonk oriented and like bipartisan approved, but was not something that I think like anyone who was not really into like climate politics could have told you anything about, could have like identified anything that they like wanted to happen from that, except for maybe like some, you could have had like a, you know, kind of a run scare campaigns about it being like a tax on, you know, making your energy more expensive, even though it wasn't a carbon tax. Anyway, the point is, it was not, it was a, it was trying to thread the needle of, I would say like policy elites and bipartisan interests, and it didn't even pass. So we didn't have even like this kind of relatively minimalist like bill. And I really think that even though, you know, that doesn't mean that it would be easy to pass like some big left-wing like Green New Deal type program, but I really, I do think that it showed the limits of that like attempt to just like bring together the center, which I think the center is even like whatever center there was then is like not remotely there now. So like I really think the only way there is to like build up more people on for the left-wing package, for that, which doesn't have to be like pitches like the left-wing package, but I feel like the package that actually is like oriented towards people and their needs, and like what is something that people can understand and see as like, oh, this is something like I want like a job or a house, and it is like also a decarbonizing program, rather than like this is like some really complicated thing that you like have never heard of, and we concocted it because like some like oil company so that they would then support it, you know. So anyway, that's my Those are the two main things I would say. No bipartisanship, and don't like cut the corners on your big stimulus package. And I do feel like actually, like, you know, it's been really interesting to see all of these like sort of more like center Democrats like move really far on the $2,000 like really fast. Like, you know, a few weeks ago it was just like Bernie basically being like, oh, we should like give everyone $2,000, and then now everyone, you know, like Trump says it, and suddenly all of these like Democrats are like, oh yeah, we love $2,000. We really want to give you the $2,000. So like, I don't know. Sometimes these things come from surprising places, I guess. But anyway, there's people can move. So that is encouraging.
All right, thank you all. If you're in the audience right now, feel free to submit some more questions. I've got a couple here that we can get started with. The first one comes from our editor emeritus, Michael Kazin. Hi, Michael. And it's directed primarily to Jasson, but I want to try to broaden this out actually to everybody. He asked specifically about, you know, the argument that the protests and the related organizing, you know, were, you know, key for voter turnout. And yet Biden, who had a, let's say, complicated relationship with the protests, you know, he himself, you know, got this much higher vote total. Democrats who tried to unseat Republicans had a lot of difficulties. So he kind of wants to ask about your argument in relation to that. I want to ask more broadly about kind of enthusiasm, and, you know, we've been using the word inertia and energy, you know, where, you know, we did have in this election, you know, this incredibly high turnout, right? We had, you know, Biden getting 7 million more votes, but we also had, you know, Trump getting, you know, millions and millions more votes. Where do you kind of see political energy right now? You know, where is there enthusiasm? Are we just all exhausted? You know, what is going on there? So Jasson, if you want to start though, we can move through.
Yeah, I just, you know, I think in regards to, I guess, the difference between Biden and the other folks, I mean, and this is anecdotal, you know, I'm an economist by I'm trying to become an economist by training. So like the causal link brain in me is screaming right now, but, and Georgia's only like one test case. But, you know, the vote totals that Ossoff and Warnock won by were higher and better than what Biden won by, right? I mean, now turnout was lower, right, overall, but in relative terms, they did better. So, I mean, I think you can not make an argument, but just say that something with Biden just wasn't right, and something with the Democratic leadership wasn't right, right? And that the minute they just got out the way, and that you had two candidates, I mean, they had their issues, they were timid on some things, but they were definitely more progressive of than of the mainstream Dems, and certainly the Dems who were going in on the Green New Deal, on on defund, on Medicare for all. They did better, they energized the base, and they were able to do good turnout, you know? So, I mean, I think Biden did, you know, you can't take away like Biden's margins of victories in suburbs, right? Those were important, right? But Biden also greatly underperformed in areas, in Black and Latinx areas, and the only areas that, and the places that he did good in were places that had strong electoral organizing infrastructure that were able to carry him and those other folks on the top, over the top. In regards to the people who did bad down ballot, I'm more on the AOC and squad argument. The people who did bad down ballot usually were folks who had bad election organizing practices. They weren't door knocking. They weren't, they didn't have good digital. And actually, AOC just didn't say this. Beto O'Rourke and his team said this also. So it's not like, this is not like, you know, like wild left-wing stuff or organizer reductionist stuff that organizing always wins the day no matter what. But I think that actually goes to better to like explaining what happened, how Biden won, and why down ballot Dems did worse. I think just on the overall thing, where things are going, I mean, I think where things are going is the GOP is going to get less votes consistently, but still win big. And the Dems, depending on who they want to go with and who, you know, like if they want to start choosing progressive and more leftist standard bearers, they will have better turnout. They'll have deeper, and they will have a more richer volunteer base and funder base and donor base. Or they can go like the more centrist route. And I look at it, the next 4 years is going to be a consistent fight between those two forces. and we'll see, you know, kind of where it goes. But I don't see most of it going anywhere until, you know, the hegemonic fight within the Democratic Party gets resolved, and then a path, an actual credible path forward. Because I don't see the centrists as capable of ever getting us to like a near supermajority or anything to like get the wins that we need. So even like wins on their terms, like passing the Biden climate plan, I don't see that happening under their theory of turning out voters in elections. Like you know, it's not possible. Yeah.
Alyssa, Vanessa, anyone want to jump in?
I'll just jump in and say that I think this sort of builds actually on a point that Jasson made, I think, in its earlier comments, but that like, I think we continue to see a lot of wins for the left, for like explicitly socialist and like far progressive, like, you know, like very progressive. I think the term Jasson used was hard progressive, which I like, at like local and state levels. And I think that that's really encouraging and exciting, and something that we should, like, another place to continue to look to build momentum and develop organizing strategies. And that doesn't necessarily solve, you know, you obviously can't like only sort of build at the local level or like expect that to then address the challenges that we have that I think are about like disparate geographies and like different, you know, geographical representation, and like what happens if you have, like, you know, you can build power in solidly democratic areas that like doesn't necessarily translate into changes in the electoral map at the national level because of like the undemocratic structures that that Jasson just mentioned. But I think that those are nevertheless really exciting and important places to be, like to be organizing people, to be trying out ideas, to be like putting things into practice on some level. You know, like for example, you know, I live just outside of Boston, and like Michelle Wu is now running for mayor of Boston on a Green New Deal platform. She's talked about things like free public transportation as part of that program, which would be something that you could do, you know, like at a local level that can scale up, that can, like, you know, we can try out things that can be ideas that we then like use other places, that can be, and this has been like I think a thing, you know, people in the climate space are always talking about like cities and states as like sort of more, you know, places to do climate action in the absence of like a national or federal, like in the absence of federal legislation. But, and that I think remains true, but it's like, what does that look like from the left? Like, what does that look like in a different moment of climate politics? What is like the Green New Deal version of that, and so on? So I think that like, that's, again, doesn't solve every problem, but I think that there's a lot of exciting things happening there.
Vanessa, any thoughts on sort of where political energy is on the right right now? It might be kind of too early to tell how things are going to play out with responses to what happened last week within the party, outside the party, but curious if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think that things are very much in flux today. It'll be very interesting to see exactly how it shakes out. I think a long-term challenge for the Republican Party is that the things that mobilize the base are not the things that mobilize the elite. There's a very strong class divide among Republicans in terms of the policies that they support. In the most obvious of those are that policies that are progressive economic policies are popular, strikingly popular in some cases with the Republican base, things like raising the minimum wage, for example. So the most clear-cut policies that most obviously will improve people's lives are things that remain popular among a large section of the Republican base, but that's not what they vote on, right? So, I mean, this is a long-term challenge of the right, is to maintain that cross-class coalition. And the extent to which they have been resolving that problem through increasingly explicit appeals to racism and keeping people from voting, both of those seem to have reached certainly an extreme. It doesn't mean it is the final extreme in any way, but it is certainly an extreme. So I think it's very challenging to say what comes next on that front. In terms of the sort of Biden and defund and the sort of electoral outcomes this year. I think in part, of course, the data are only just barely available now to start looking at some of those things. But, you know, one thing that's true about a close election is, and in any number of states, many of these elections were close, is that many factors are plausibly larger than the margin of victory or defeat. And I think that that, to me, suggests that probably the best strategy is to do what you think is right, as opposed to constantly chase after the sort of and I think often people who are claiming that oh, defund the police is the problem, and they are simply backfilling a strategic rationale onto an ideological commitment, right? But anyway, I think that there's very little reason to couch the your value commitments in terms of their likelihood of electoral strategic gain. I don't think the evidence is always there for it, and I don't think it's what appeals to people.
All right, thanks, Vanessa. So we've got some more questions coming in. I've got a couple questions, and I'm already dreading asking about 2022 and 2024, which maybe these questions suggest part of what we're talking about, which is this kind of feeling of pessimism about politics in the current moment. But these questions are specific, someone predicting, Democratic loss of, one or both houses in 2022, and then someone else asking about, preparation for those periods and relationship with the Democratic Party. So I put it to you all, if you have thoughts about sort of what the kind of dynamics between the sorts of movement things we're talking about, the electoral politics are going to be in the aftermath of Republican defeat that is also coming with, right-wing energy still like on the ground, and some similar dynamics maybe playing out on the left.
One thing I'll say is a pretty obvious thing is the need for democratic reform right away, just of the very basic, not the deep democratic reform that we all believe in. I'm just talking about the really obvious stuff like people being able to vote. Those reforms need to happen instantly because, and Jason's talking about this already, the margins are so high already just to win now that we can't, in a system with as many veto points as the United States government was designed to have and continues to have, you're not going to get a fair fight, but we're so far from a fair fight now that if we don't address that problem, the challenges ahead approach insurmountable. But that is merely a starting point.
Alyssa, Jason, I know you've both already talked a little bit about sort of the movement electoral interplay, but yeah, if you have any further thoughts on this right now, or on the democratic reform, we also got another question about those kind of, really crucial reforms to the system right now. So on any of that.
I agree with Vanessa that we really, that there are some basic thing. There are some basic democratic reforms that I think that seem really necessary. We haven't talked about the Supreme Court yet, yet at all. I don't know, that sort of has kind of vanished from conversation over the past couple of months, and is a extremely, I think, serious obstacle to a lot of future legislative type projects, certainly around climate. I'm very worried about a right-wing 6-3 Supreme Court for decades being able to block a huge amount of both uses. I think we've sort of stretched the Clean Air Act as far as it will go on climate, but also new pieces of legislation. So, there was a very brief moment when Democrats were talking about expanding the court, and that has vanished because that has also become one of the scary things from the left that no one can talk about. But we have to be talking about all of these things, I think. And Republicans are already trying to spin all of this as like any democratic reform is just like trying to, like put a finger on the scales, Democrats trying to stuff the ballot box, all of this stuff. That they're going to run with that narrative as far as it takes them, and I think the only thing to do is really to like try to do something that I think Republicans are better at, which is like consolidating their power and their ability to win future power. Usually, I mean, for Republicans, it's usually by like disenfranchising people, making it harder to vote. Democrats sometimes do that, but I think less consistently in terms of just like making sure that they can win in the future to do other things. So yeah, I agree with Vanessa. We have to do that.
Yeah, I would just, I mean, for 2022, 2024, I think it depends. I mean, yes to everything that was already said. I do though think that it, like not all things are determined, right? We don't have to have a 2022 go to the GOP side. There's things that the left can do and Democrats can do. I think the two biggest things are going to be, economic relief and stimulus in regards to COVID and handling of the COVID crisis. But like long-term, not means tested or, complicated stimulus and economic relief. And then also, impeachment and expulsion of those or attempts to do so and hold accountable those folks who did the Capitol riots. I think those things do matter and set the term and set the ground for which the terrain that GOP fights on, and it allows us to define the agenda of what 2022 and 2024 will be about. Yeah, and then I think also too, I mean, just in terms of like on the more socialist side, hard progressive side. I only say that because, our mayor and I think a bunch of the mayors have like all ran on as progressives, and like, they just fucking love cops and they just love not giving relief. They're just like, they're at times they feel like harder right than even Biden. I'm just like, it's unreal. So anyways, but I think it's, what we do in the local races also, I think is always like some level of a signal to what them should be doing and what they can do and what's politically possible. So I think expanding our wins from those kind of candidates will go a long way into determining how 2022 is played and 2024 is played. Last thing, super insider strategy, which is like, or not really insider strategy or insider ball, it's just that also still trying to win the fight of running turnout elections versus persuasion elections, that like we have to win that fight. And if we do those things, like win that fight, that persuasion, turnout elections is what gets us the goods, is what gets us wins. And like, that type of leadership gets appointed within the Democratic Party, then we'll be in a much better place. And I think I'm a little bit more hopeful than 2020 about 2022 and 2024. And I think that Biden and the Democrats have learned something from Obama's years. Maybe I'm being too hopeful, but yeah.
Got time for maybe one or two more questions, and I've got a couple here that are specifically related to Vanessa's article and around the taxpayer rhetoric, and then another one about sort of just deficit hawkery and whether this is going to make a comeback. Certainly, I think that was maybe some of the motivation, Vanessa, for writing this article. But I think clearly issues around taxation, revenue, deficits are going to be, they could start to play once again a major role in discussion of climate politics. And as Jasson said, like this is for in his organizing work, this is the first time that a budget fight became kind of entrenched in the public mind. So. What do you see as kind of playing out in those terms right now at a moment when interest rates are low? There doesn't seem to be much concern that we had seen in previous eras around deficits.
Yeah, so I think right. So from an economic perspective, clearly it's plausibly, if these arguments were couched in some sort of reality, they would be harder to make. But they aren't, so the deficit arguments will continue to be made because they're basically sort of a moral argument, I think primarily in terms of, sort of a moralization of saving over spending and a sort of an adoption of a household budget mentality to the federal government, which that makes no sense. But yeah, so I think that one of the interesting things we're seeing literally today is the Republican Party is deciding how long they want to stand very directly with Donald Trump, right? And I mean, they've stood with him for a very long time, and they may all decide in the end that they're going to stay. But it looked a little more complicated than that as of, say, this afternoon. And what that means to the other banner that the Republican Party has, other than the banner of Trump, is this sort of sober fiscal conservative banner. And they try and act like those are different, and they're not. This is what I talk about in my article, that these are fundamentally interrelated movements. The sort of white supremacist, racist movement and the austerity movement are related movements and have always been in America related movements. But anyway, so I think they will attempt to, probably some percentage of them, no matter how long they stand with Trump, will try and revert back to that older, the sort of 1980s version where the racism was more dog whistle and less bullhorn. I think that switch will probably have some challenges in terms of its, first of all, it doesn't particularly appeal to the Republican base the way that Trump did. It also doesn't, will also be a pretty hard shift pretty fast. And the Republican Party has to some extent damaged its credibility on any of a number of issues in the last few years. I want to actually respond. I see the question in the Q&A specifically about the Reconstruction era, and are there tactics from the Reconstruction era that would be effective in opposing the taxpayer Confederate rebrand? And I love that question, and I'm going to spend so much more time thinking about it. But one thing that occurred to me, what they couldn't do in the South was spend money that they didn't have. They couldn't do it because they were states, right? The Southern states were absolutely broke. But they couldn't spend money, and there was no Marshall Plan, right? So the thing that our federal government can do is spend money without taxing, and there are so many things to spend it on, right? Basically, anything that Alyssa wants done would be at the top of my list on the spending, but we have just an extraordinary power that was unavailable to them, right? They had to find the money. And one of a way in which slavery is not commonly discussed, but it is a redistribution of wealth to the people whose labor was being stolen. But that wealth then disappeared, and you couldn't tax it. And thank God. But then, from a tax perspective, it made it harder to tax slaveholders because they suddenly didn't have slaves, so you had to tax their land, and that meant you caught a lot of subsistence farmers in Appalachia. And then I was talking about earlier, this is what made that taxpayer brand appealing. You can walk away from having that entire problem now, right? Because you can spend and you can deal with the tax problem later. And on a bunch of issues, the spending will make the tax problem smaller in the future because people will have more money, right? So I think that there is actually a way to think about the Reconstruction era's tax policies, and it's the challenges that were, in a sense, insurmountable without land reform. And is actually kind of an optimistic story about at least what's available now. That was genuinely unavailable then. But I think, to the extent that Democrats can continue to be frightened by deficit hawkery, then it forecloses every option that would actually solve anything in this country.
Yeah, I just want to throw out too that, our government never needs to tax in order to spend. Just throwing it out there. Yeah.
Right. That's the special magic of the federal government. It was not available to the Reconstruction governments of the American South.
Article. Wow, they actually had to really tax and spend.
Yeah, they had no. There was not. It wasn't. You couldn't just print some money or something. It was not an available option. Yeah.
I agree with all that. I also just want to say, I think on the last piece Vanessa said around Democrats being afraid of deficit hawk label, I just can't emphasize enough how much I think we just have seen I think everyone has seen the fiction of the deficit hawk label laid before us. So we just can never let anyone say, how are you going to pay for it again after money, huge amounts of money that like previously would have been unthinkable have like materialized to address COVID as they should. And I think we just have to like remind people of that all the time, because it's not just like somebody saying, I don't know, I think this has made that more concrete in a very useful way for those who are like opposed to austerity measures. And so I think we just have to like constantly just like push back and just like reject that, and with reference to like, you know, what people have seen over this past year, and to like let that actually, to trust that people actually will be more skeptical of some of that framing than they might have been if we're like able to talk about it in a way that that is, you know, like linking deficit talk back to like this whole experience. So
also too, I think just having an explicit message that like deficits do not matter, that Congress creates spending, deficits do not matter. As long as, even sometimes like on the side of like tax suspense socialism and progressivism, when we get into like that rhetoric, it just puts us in a I mean, you know, the rich should be taxed because I believe in class struggle, and people shouldn't have that much money, but you know, we don't need the rich to be taxed in order to pay for all these other things. And the minute we start getting into that circle, into that level of the fight, you know, I think we're playing against ourselves and fighting against ourselves. And I think, you know, the Communist Squad and then them using MMT type economists, I think that has pushed a narrative that where then the Jasson Furmans and other folks who do believe that you can deficit spend to a certain degree are heard more than the other type of democratic economists who are always worried about the deficit or arguing for the deficit.
Just want to give a little plug to a piece that we have also in this winter issue, currently behind the paywall, so that's you know, incentive for everyone to subscribe, by Daniel Wartell London, that is about sort of critical fiscal theories of the state and the kind of way that you know, wealthy people, corporations have, you know, at various points sort of been able to hold public spending hostage through risk of capital flight and all of these sorts of things. We're going to have that piece out somewhat soon, and I believe also someone involved with New York DSA's Tax the Rich campaign within the state of New York right now is going to be involved in some dialogue around that as well. So a lot of questions to think about the purposes of taxation and how that rhetoric can be used in a positive program as well. Let me see, I think we might have one more. Yeah, so I want to ask if any of you have any more closing thoughts that you wanted to share, anything that you didn't get to say, opportunity to say that right now.
You know, I forgot one point around the deficit stuff, because you're talking about articles, and then I was thinking about that monetary democracy article, which is that, like, you know, I mean, the administration, Democrats just had to have a much harder line with the Federal Reserve in terms of giving money directly to cities and states. And it has the ability to do it, has the capacity to do it, it can do it. It just needs to have the pressure put on it in order to do it, which is in many ways a workaround in a time of, like, you know, political paralysis that can take care of a lot of spending issues that we have right now. So.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say one more thing. I think in the long term, there's nothing wrong with raising taxes. You know, both obviously raising taxes on rich people, which is a great idea all around. They have far too much money, but also, you know, having people contribute to the government is something that, for one thing, protects public programs, right? I mean, you look at Social Security and you see that people paid into it, and then you try and take it from them and they get very angry. And also, more generally speaking, that, you know, having a fear of asking Americans to do something for their country is an extremely non-progressive view of the American citizenry. And so I think that we should, not now in a time of absolute crisis, but in the future, certainly, you know, ask people to pay taxes, because that's the money that, you know, that turns your labor into public goods, and that's a great thing. So there's no reason to walk away from it entirely. It's just nothing that it needs to be done to deal with any of the compounding crises that we are facing right now.
I have a final comment that is not about taxes or the deficit, but that's a kind of a broader point, and probably something I should have brought up in the sort of question about like where energy is right now. But I guess I just wanted to say that even though we've been talking a lot about like electoral politics here, and even if not like electoral specific, electorally oriented politics, both with like the Trump election and then kind of what's look forward to in 2022 and 2024, I want to just like put in a word for the like non-electorally oriented projects, things that are not like thinking about how to like game out 2022, 2024, because I think that is really where the energy is coming from now, right? Like, and like that's what Jasson's piece is about, right? That like pieces, I mean, I think that like energy can be coming from places that aren't about winning elections, that can nevertheless energize people in a way that does win elections, and we can't always tell where those things will be. But I think I've been very, I was very dismayed by the, you know, kind of like chastising of the left wing, I guess both the left wing of the Democratic Party and the left in general from centrist Democrats, not just because I thought a lot of it was wrong or like intra-party disputes, but because I think it really was trying to suggest that like we shouldn't do politics unless it helps like this one electoral project, right? And like, and I don't think that's how politics works. I don't think that's how like ideas work. I don't think that's how radical projects get advanced. And so I think I just want to put in a pitch for the like things that are like not necessarily pragmatically oriented towards like winning over like a swing voter or whoever, which I don't think anyone here has done, but just because we kind of talked about that a little less, and that like maybe we don't have to tailor everything to what we think will prepare us for 2022 and 2024, and that might be where, you know, like I think with climate, the most exciting energy has come from like, you know, activists at Standing Rock, activists in Sunrise, people who are pushing the boundaries rather than like trying to like, you know, move the pieces around like the congressional board. So I hope we see a lot more of that kind of energy in years to come. And I think we will actually. So I feel that's what I feel most optimistic about, is like all of this like what I feel like is building energy on the left in like a lot of different places. I don't really know where it's going to go right now, but I do feel very certain that it will like be, that people will be organizing and doing a lot of things that I can't anticipate right now, and that is what makes me most hopeful. So
just one more thing I forgot. I promised it would be the last thing. So they're starting this research project on like tracking how much of CARES Act money was spent on police, you know, and it's been like, I mean, right now it's just eyeballing, but it looks like, you know, anywhere from like 30 to like 80% of like CARES Act money when it gets to a city or a county goes to policing, you know, and so I think just the idea is like being that it's important that like when we're having like these stimulus and economic and like aids to states and localities, like the debates, I mean, we should have criterias around, you know, is it green or not, but also like defund or divest, you know, however you want to call it, divest, invest, like those kind of criterias that, you know, the type of economic relief spending, state and local spending that we're doing isn't about police, but is about schools, making our communities better, public health, things like that. So just throwing it out there.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight, Vanessa, Alyssa, Jasson. Everyone, again, check out the issue. Thanks to everyone who came to the event tonight and submitted questions. And I think we're going to wrap up. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.
thank you.
Thank you. That was great. I appreciated it. Oh, am I not supposed to talk right now?
Are we no longer broadcasting? Maybe.
We're still live on Facebook. So.
On Facebook. All right. Well, in that case, yeah.
Everyone, time to like shit talk.
All right. Bye, Facebook, and bye, everybody else. Good night.
Bye.